Good evening and welcome. It is 10 after, it is time. We can officially start this event. Welcome to this annual distinguished lecture on Europe. My name is Geneviève Zubriski. I'm professor of sociology, director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and director of the Center for European Studies. The Center for European Studies is dedicated to improving understanding of European history and the European Union in the 21st century. CES brings together more than 100 faculty in more than 20 departments of LS&A and 8 other schools and colleges at the University of Michigan. These faculty affiliates regularly teach and conduct research on a wide variety of themes related to Europe, training the next generation of scholars in European studies. Each year, CES holds a distinguished lecture on Europe, and for this event, we ask a particularly interesting and broad-minded thinker to challenge us to think in new ways about Europe, its history, its current state, and its future. So tonight we have the distinct pleasure to host Jan-Werner Mueller, professor of politics at Princeton University, who will speak to us about populism, a key political phenomenon of our times. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, however, I'd like to say a few words about the colleague to whom tonight's distinguished lecture is dedicated, Kathleen Canning, Sonia Rose Collegiate Professor of History, Women's Studies, and German. Professor Canning specializes in the European and transnational history of gender, sexuality, and citizenship, and was the founding director of the Center for European Studies, which she led in the years 1995 to 1998. During her term as director, the center participated in the Ford Foundation initiatives focused on revitalizing area studies, organizing major events around minority citizenships in contemporary Europe. As director, she worked on several major grant proposals, which eventually led CES to being recognized as a EU center. Last but not least, her efforts at institution building led to CES obtaining real office space, which was a significant accomplishment and which at Michigan we're always eager to facilitate. She managed to leave the place, able to hire dedicated staff and securing International Institute funding for the center, all of which made the job of those who succeed in her much, much easier to do. So thank you for that. After her term ended, Kathleen remained an active member of CES, a devoted teacher and mentor to students working on European topics, and a cherished and respected colleague. Professor Canning is unfortunately leaving Michigan to become Dean of the Humanities at Rice University starting on January 1st. And we wish her all the best in that new and exciting role. Thank you. And we have a small token of appreciation for all your work you've done. So this is a small memento. The real gift is this.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. And now back to our distinguished speaker. Jan-Werner Mueller is professor of politics at Princeton, as I said, and has held many prestigious appointments in Europe and in the United States. He co-founded and directed the European College of Liberal Arts, ECLA in Berlin, Germany's first private English-speaking liberal arts college, and he's also a frequent contributor, among others, to The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books, making him a key interlocutor in public affairs on both sides of the Atlantic. He's also a prolific author, and his work has been translated in over a dozen languages. It includes the book Another Country, German Intellectuals, Unification and National Identity, published by Yale in 2000, A Dangerous Mind, Carl Schmitt in Post-War European Thought, Yale again, Memory and Power in Post-War Europe, Studies in the Presence of the Past by Cambridge in 2002, Constitutional Patriotism by Princeton, I don't have the year for that one, I apologize, and Contesting Democracy, Political Ideas in 20th Century Europe. His latest book, What is Populism, here, could not have appeared at a more auspicious moment. And we're extremely pleased that he agreed to be with us tonight to discuss what the problem with populism is. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Jan-Werner Müller. Okay, sorry.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here and to give the lecture on a word which, as you all know, has been used in our time in an absolutely inflationary manner. All kinds of political actors, left, right, even center, have been called populists in our day. Might even, for instance, think back to the French presidential elections in the spring, where even poor Emmanuel Macron was accused of being a populist, namely, as people said at the time, a populist of the extreme center. Whatever that meant, exactly. Moreover, as you all know, up until the spring this year, we were constantly told that there was now a virtually unstoppable wave, or as Nigel Farage, for whom apparently the image of the wave was too small, put it, a tsunami of populism which, to stay with the metaphor, was going to wash away the establishment, the elites, everywhere. After March 16th this year, day after the Dutch elections, the story in many media changed radically. All of a sudden we were told that we might already be living in the post-populist moment, a sense that was further increased after the French elections and which now, after the German elections, might be in doubt again. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that all these stories about supposedly inevitable developments, waves advancing, waves receding, are deeply misleading. And I'll try to say something about why I think these tales are so misleading towards the end of my remarks tonight. But before, let me first of all offer you a hopefully more precise understanding than the one that we so frequently find in political commentary today. Secondly, allow me to say a few words about what populists do when they gain power, especially in light of the widespread view that actually populists are fundamentally unable to exercise power and to govern. And then thirdly, by way of conclusion also, let me say a few words about how one could possibly counter populists. So let me begin with an attempt to offer us a somewhat more precise understanding of what we're actually talking about. The conventional wisdom of our time is, of course, that populists are those who, as the cliched phrase goes, criticize elites or are rising up against the establishment. When you think about it, this is actually an extremely strange thought. Any old civics textbook would have told you that it's a sign of good democratic engagement to keep an eye, a close eye, on the powerful, in politics, in the economy, but also for that matter in culture and, come to think of it, universities. All of a sudden, at the beginning of the 21st century, we're told that anybody who actually does this is automatically a dangerous populist. So that can't be quite right. Now, to be sure, when populists are in opposition, they criticize the government, if you like, the powerful. But above all, populists do something else. Populists will always, in one way or another, claim that they, and only they, represent what populists frequently call the real people, or also very typically the silent majority. Now, at first sight, that might actually not sound so dangerous or bad. It's not immediately the same thing as racism or, let's say, for instance, a fanatical hatred of the European Union. And yet, what you might call more abstractly, this claim to a moral monopoly of representing the people, always, in my view, has two dangerous consequences for democracy. First of all, populists will also always end up saying that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this is never just a question of disagreements about policy, or for that matter, even disagreement about values, which of course is completely normal in a democracy and ideally productive for a democracy. No, populists will always immediately make it personal, and they will always immediately make it moral. The problem is that the other contenders for power are corrupt and crooked. Might remind us of something. And indeed, I would say that in this regard, the man who is now president of this country was an extreme, but he was not truly an exception. The kinds of things that Donald J. Trump said about Hillary Clinton are the kinds of things that all populists in one way or another are going to say about their rivals. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists will also claim that all those, if you like, among the people themselves, among citizens, who do not share their understanding of the supposedly real people, and hence logically do not support populists politically, that all those citizens can have their status as properly belonging to the people put into doubt. Let me try to illustrate this perhaps not so obvious point with two brief examples. Many of you will remember how still during the night of Brexit, Nigel Farage gave a speech where he said that this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% of Brits who wanted to stay inside the EU, well, on some level, aren't quite real, don't truly belong to the British, or maybe in the case of Farage, more specifically, the English people. Or think back to a pronouncement by Donald Trump in a speech which otherwise was hardly noted. In May 2016, he said, I'm quoting from memory, "The only important thing is the unification of the people, because all the other people don't mean anything." I hope you can see where this is going. The populist thinks that he or she is in a position to decide who truly belongs and who doesn't belong to the people. And you might end up being declared not to belong, even if you happen to legally belong, even if you happen to, as in this case, happen to have an American passport. Long story short, what matters about populism is not some vague anti-elitism or anti-establishment sentiment. Not everybody who criticizes elites is automatically right, but he or she is also not automatically a danger for democracy. What matters about populism is anti-pluralism, the tendency of populists always to exclude, and more specifically exclude at two levels. At the level of, if you like, the elite, party politics, other politicians who are declared illegitimate, and less obviously at that other level of the people themselves, where some are told that they do not truly belong to the people. Now, allow me to add two thoughts to this relatively abstract first sketch of what I think we're really talking about when we're talking about populism. First of all, let me add that even in situations where populists do not gain power, they might do real damage to the political culture of a democracy. Why? Well, if you find anything worthwhile in the approach I'm trying to present to you, then clearly all those populists who lose an election or who don't gain overwhelming majorities at the polls have a bit of a problem on their hands. They're facing a contradiction. For how can it be that on the one hand, they and only they represent the people, and on the other hand, they don't win at the ballot box? I'm not saying that all populists will do this, but plenty of them resort to a strategy where, in essence, they take a second, or if you like, closer look at that infamous concept, the silent majority. By definition, if the majority weren't silent, populists would always already be in power. But maybe, or so they suggest, we aren't really talking about a silent majority. Maybe we're talking about a silenced majority. Maybe somebody or something kept the majority from truly expressing itself. In other words, very often, not always, but very often, populists, in the face of a defeat, will open the door to some version of conspiracy theory. They will essentially suggest to their supporters that elites were manipulating things behind the scenes and hence preventing them and preventing the real people from expressing themselves. Again, I probably don't need to remind you of those memorable moments in November 2016 when the man who today is president famously said, well, if I accept her win, I'll tell you at the time if I'm going to accept defeat. Of course, everybody understood what that meant. Some surveys showed that 70% of Trump supporters said, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. Now, don't get me wrong. All of us can criticize the existing electoral system. There's plenty to criticize. Again, it can be a sign of good democratic engagement to care about these things, to criticize existing practices. But what you can't do is to say, like the populists, because we didn't win, it must have been rigged. That is not a democratic attitude. Secondly, let me just very briefly address a claim that is sometimes made in favor of populism in this kind of context. It's sometimes said that, yes, all right, populists might have this exclusionary rhetoric, and the way they talk is often very uncouth, but could it not still be true that in the end they play an important role in bringing the people closer to the existing democratic institutions? Isn't it, for instance, true, especially but not only in Europe, that very frequently populists will demand a referendum on a particular question, and hence prima facie seem to be in favor of more citizen involvement and participation? Well, referenda can mean very different things for different actors. I don't think that populists have a principled interest in more citizen participation. For the way they really operate runs something like this. In a first step, they will always define, or if you like, symbolically construct, what they consider to be the real people. In a second step, they will then deduce from that construction a supposedly singular, authentic will of the people. And then thirdly, they will say, like Trump, for instance, during the Republican convention in 2016, I am your voice. But notice that this has been an entirely theoretical process. Nobody else has really spoken during this whole operation. In a certain way, populists always already know what the right answer is for a referendum. And the role of the people is simply to check that right answer. They're not interested in opening up a sort of deliberative process where you simply don't know in advance how people will react to new arguments, what new judgments and conclusions they might come to. No, populists always already know the right answer. Let me give you a brief example to illustrate this point from very recent European history. Probably will remember that Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban had a so-called national consultation about a year ago. Question was whether Brussels should be allowed to settle migrants in Hungary without the consent of the Hungarian parliament. You can probably guess what kind of answer Viktor Orban wanted the people to give. And he got the answer he wanted. 98% of those who participated in this referendum said, no way, we absolutely are against Brussels settling migrants in Hungary without the consent of the parliament. Slight problem though, not enough people participated in the referendum to make it valid. Too few people actually turned up. Now in this case, someone like Orban couldn't say what other populists, the kind I just described a minute ago, could say. Namely, it's all been rigged. For after all, Viktor Orban himself has spent 7 years rigging the entire political system in Hungary, plus the economy, plus the culture, and everything else. Moreover, he spent, according to some estimates, more money on a campaign to get the right answer in this referendum than was spent during the entire Brexit campaign if you put Remain and Leave together. So he couldn't really say it was rigged. But it didn't matter. Again, the silent majority came to the rescue. For now, the government claimed that all those people who had stayed at home, of course, agreed with the government. Hence, there was no problem about the procedural invalidity of the referendum. And Orban was off to Brussels the next day, telling what he usually calls the liberal nihilists who run the EU, that for the first time, the people had finally spoken, and no, they didn't like refugees to be settled in a proper Christian country. So long story short, what populists, one way or the other, will always try to do is play off this symbolic construction of the real people against the existing democratic procedures. If I may, one last example also from very recent history. You remember the Austrian presidential election in 2006. Actually, there were many because, a couple were declared invalid and then the envelopes didn't work and so on. Anyway, there was a moment when the populist candidate clearly seemed to have lost. And he somehow had to explain that defeat. And the way he explained it, I'm afraid this only really works very nicely in German, was to say, the winning candidate, who was an old green professor with, dubious ethnic heritage, not a man of the people, not anybody who could possibly have won this election. This man, according to Norbert Hofer, the man who lost, the man of the people, it was said, ist gezählt, aber ist nicht gewählt. So yes, he won according to the numbers. The counting worked out in his favor, but he wasn't truly elected. Now, with all due respect, in a democracy there is no such distinction. All we have is numbers. All we can do is count ballots, in this boring way that happens on election days, and that is the decision. And anybody who plays off this amorphous real people out there against these results is doing something dangerous. Or, for those who care particularly about the history of political theory, they're essentially repeating a typical operation from Carl Schmitt that he invented in the 1920s to discredit liberal democracy. All right, swiftly on to my second chapter. What do populists do when they get to power? Well, there is a widespread view that virtually by definition, they actually can't govern. Why? Well, according to some people, all their policy ideas are so horrendously simplistic that on the first day of them being in power, it's going to turn out that nothing works. No, the wall will not be built. No, these economic promises cannot be redeemed, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, there's a widespread view which says that, well, Populists are always protest parties. But once you get into government, you can't keep protesting against yourself. Or variation of this theme, they're always anti-elitist. But once they're in government, surely they themselves are the elite, and they cannot possibly continue an anti-elitist discourse. These are all very comforting, naive illusions. No populist has ever run out of scapegoats. No populist has ever run out of finding yet a further elite somewhere that is preventing from having him or her implement the real will of the real people. And more interestingly, it turns out that populists really can govern as populists, by which I mean they can govern as committed anti-pluralists, as actors who do not fundamentally recognize the legitimacy of an opposition, as actors who typically will not accept criticism from independent institutions, such as typically constitutional courts or free media. They will always immediately counter any criticism by saying, we're elected, you're not, democracy is with us, who are you to question us? And as you all know, we've seen this in plenty of cases in recent years. We've seen it in Hungary. We're seeing it in Poland. We have seen it in Turkey. We're seeing it to some degree in India now, and we're seeing it, well, you know where. This is, I think, fairly obvious in terms of what it means for a populist to govern and what kind of rhetoric they will employ. Somewhat less obvious might be three further elements of what by now you might even perversely call a populist art of governance. First, populists will always try to essentially subordinate the state itself to them, by which I mean that they will not really accept the idea of an independent bureaucracy or civil service, nor they will try to place partisan actors in nominally neutral bureaucratic positions. Now, some of you might come back to me and say, well, look, plenty of parties around the world do that. For many people, that's just the name of the game, of what it means to acquire power. Fair enough. But the difference is that in many cases, populists will do this very openly and with what in their eyes is a distinctly moral argument. For they will say that after all, the state exists for the people. And remember, they and only they represent the people. So it's only right and proper that the people themselves take possession of the state. Secondly, populists will also very typically engage in something that political scientists tend to call mass clientelism, which is just a highfalutin way of saying that people in power will basically reward their supporters with material benefits or maybe with bureaucratic favors. Again, you might come back to me and say, well, that's absolutely typical. You know, all parties do this in one way or another. There's nothing peculiarly populist about this. Again, the difference is that something that in other situations people try to hide, populists will do very openly and yet again with what in their eyes is a moral argument. For remember that not all the people are the real people. It's only fair and just that only some get benefits, and the fact that everybody else is excluded is not something that has to be hidden. It's something that basically is a matter of proper justice. Thirdly, when there is any kind of protest, any kind of dissent, civil society on the streets against populist governments, it becomes both symbolically and morally supremely important for these populist actors comprehensively to discredit that protest, even in situations where there is no real threat to their power. Why? Again, it goes back to this basic populist claim of we and only we represent the people. By definition, it cannot be true that parts of the people themselves are rising up against their only legitimate representatives. What do they typically do in situations like this? Well, in many ways, what we are seeing almost everywhere today in populist regimes was pioneered by Vladimir Putin. He was the first one to develop a comprehensive strategy according to which people constantly had to be told that what to the innocent, naive observer looked like genuine civil society out there on the streets was, of course, all paid for and manipulated by outside forces. The CIA, George Soros, whoever it might be. There are no limits to creativity and originality in this regard. Remember, for instance, the Gezi Park protests. Members of the Turkish government immediately came out and said, no, it's not real Turkish citizens protesting here. Who's really behind it? Well, it was obvious. It was Lufthansa. Because Lufthansa was afraid from increased competition from Turkish airlines, given that they had just opened this new airport close to Istanbul. Point is that even in situations where the threat isn't real, it's very important for these populist actors to hold on to their core moral anti-pluralist claim. Allow me a quick footnote to this point, and then I'll try to also show you a quick visual example of what I'm trying to talk about. I think one respect in which populists have become markedly more subtle and sophisticated is in their ability to very consciously sometimes actually incorporate protest into their own narrative, which is usually in one way or another a narrative centered on culture war. A culture war where on the one hand you have the real people, and on the other hand you have those who do not truly, properly belong. Let me, if I can master that technology, try to give you a brief example of what I'm trying to talk about. This is, well, you'll see what it's from and what it's about. No need to pay much attention to the words. Just, in a sense, try to see what the dramaturgy suggests to us.
Et à l'inertie se substitueront la lucidité, le courage et l'action. Ne soyez ni anxieux ni abattus, soyez juste impatients. Les forces qui montent du pays sont puissantes, comme un instinct de survie, je les crois irrésistibles. Des obstacles se dresseront devant nous encore. La bataille politique sera âpre et évidemment. Rien ne nous sera épargné, c'est une certitude. Ça a déjà commencé et je les pense capables des pires extrémités. Mais nous triompherons de tout cela. Et de ces batailles électorales naîtra une nation libre, fière, confiante, fraternelle, où il fera un nouveau bon vivre. Oui, de ce combat, la France renaîtra. À ceux, enfin, qui sont parfois saisis par le doute ou par la crainte, je rappellerai ces mots de Bernanos. L'espérance est un risque à courir. Vive la République, vive le peuple et vive la France!
Thank you. Maybe the film studies scholars in the audience will disagree, but I think Leni Riefenstahl would at least have given one thumb up for this concoction. Allow me to say a couple of words about the context here. So this depicts a ritual which actually no longer exists. Every 1st of May, the National Front laid a wreath at the statue of Joan of Arc in Paris. It no longer exists because after 2015, they decided that the threat of terrorism was so great that they couldn't have an outdoors event. They would have to have instead a banquet inside. Of course, one thing that is immediately noticeable about this film is that Joan of Arc, the statue, is never seen. But in a sense, it's obvious why, because our present day Joan of Arc is fully in the picture. Secondly, you will all have noticed that all of a sudden something very incongruous happens here. When the camera pans to the balcony, you see these 3 bare-breasted women with these big banners saying, Heil Le Pen. And many of you will have probably had the thought that these must be Femen activists protesting against the event. That was indeed the case. What one doesn't see here is that basically the protesters were treated extremely brutally by the security personnel of the National Front. They were sort of choked, their hair was pulled. Anyway, they were removed, and we'll see, of course, at the end here that once they are removed, the music goes a certain way, everybody smiles, and so on and so forth. What am I trying to get across to you? I'm trying to get across to you that in a depiction like this, the protest isn't denied. It's not like it didn't happen. Instead, it's basically incorporated into a particular narrative. And in a certain way, I think it's not too much to say, the narrative is in a certain way even about 2 rival feminisms. Because it's of course so noticeable that what we see among the National Front here is mostly young women defending Republican values of liberty, equality, and so on and so forth. And then there is that crazy feminism, that basically has to be suppressed, has to be vanquished, and the good feminism and the real France triumph in the end. God forbid, I'm not suggesting that one shouldn't go out and protest. I just want to put the thought on the table that protest will not always translate into some enormous damage to populist movements or populist governments. Remember those moments in January this year when plenty of people said, look, millions of people on the street against the Muslim travel ban. This is already so damaging for Trump that this has happened. Well, I can't prove it to you, maybe I'm wrong, but I could imagine a scenario where Steve Bannon in the White House says, bingo, thank God all these homeland-hating, minority, bleeding heart liberals are showing themselves. And if anything happens, we know who to blame. Certainly, rhetoric like this was explicitly used by Viktor Orban's government. Remember that there were protests in April this year against the possible closure of Central European University. Many people came out on the streets, not just students, but educators, so-called ordinary people, old people, all kinds. And what did the government say? The government said, well, good. Now we finally dragged the Soros network out into the open. They are more than we thought, but at least they've become much more visible now. So long story short, all these actors in one form or another engage in culture wars. And hence, they very often have an interest in actually keeping their culture war going by incorporating protest into their particular cultural narratives about who belongs and who doesn't belong. All right, swiftly on to the very last chapter of my remarks tonight. What can be done? Allow me to preface that sort of self-helpy sounding part by emphasizing that, in my view at least, far too often this question is being treated as if it were simply a sort of PR problem or a matter of, offering better narratives. You all know the kinds of actors who go around and say, the EU needs a new narrative. And we will now, you know, get intellectuals and advertisers and so on into the room to manufacture our new narrative to make people passionate about the EU again. It's not just a PR issue. Of course, it's also a question of policy content. And I think that message in particular needs to be addressed to, let's say, broadly speaking, social democratic and socialist parties in Europe today. We can talk more about this if you like. I just sort of wanted to issue this health warning not to fall into the trap of pretending that, oh, if only, you know, we kind of generate a manual with 10 bullet points with the best strategies, the best narratives, this sort of stuff will disappear. It won't, just on the basis of strategy. So having said that, let me initially at least point to two typical responses to populist forces which I think by now we know really do not work. And they precisely don't work on a strategic level, but they also have a problem on a, if you like, moral or normative level. What do I mean? Well, one typical approach is, of course, to say we exclude these actors completely. We won't even talk to them. We won't appear with them on television. If their representatives ask questions in Parliament, we will walk out, we will not answer, we will basically just show how much we object to them. Well, on a strategic level, I think it's been shown many times that this wonderfully confirms the very story which populists are always offering to their own supporters. The elites never listen. There are all these taboo topics that nobody is willing to talk about. Look, you know, the existing elites, all they can do in the end is kind of unite against us because they're so afraid of us. So it doesn't work on that strategic or, if you like, instrumental level. But there's also a problem on a, if you like, level of democratic theory. Especially if these parties are already represented in parliaments, then a fundamental decision not to engage with these actors basically amounts to denying representation to all those citizens who voted for them. And very importantly, we can never just conclude that all voters of populist parties are themselves populists, which in my sense means anti-pluralists. They may well be in certain cases. But it's not a totally crazy idea that, for instance, somebody in France says, look, you know, I'm a farmer. I don't really care about all the stuff that Marine Le Pen says about the other parties, but, you know, she really has the best agricultural policy. And that's why I want her deputies to be in Parliament. Granted, a bit of an artificial example, but I hope you can see what I'm trying to get at. Secondly, there is, of course, what you might call the other extreme from this position of we have to exclude them completely. The other extreme, where all of a sudden one starts to run after them. One starts to copy them. And very often this actually comes with a sort of explicit justification. Very often politicians, but also journalists, switch from a position where they say, oh, these are all demagogues, they're always lying, we don't believe a word of what they say. They switch from that position to one where they say, but you know what? Maybe these actors know about, as the cliche then usually goes, the real sorrows and worries of people. So all of a sudden, from a position where we basically reject everything they say, we switch to a position where they have a sort of monopoly almost of sociological truth. They somehow know something about society that all the actors don't know. I'm not saying that everybody who says this really believes it, but it very often comes in as a handy justification for the kinds of actors who will then run after populists. And again, this clearly doesn't work on a strategic level. The typical response by populists is, of course, to say, look, they're just copying us, but the original remains available. Vote for the original. The kind of lesson that someone like Nicolas Sarkozy learned the hard way after he started to run after Marine Le Pen in 2015, 2016 in the preparations for the French presidential elections. And in any case, no matter how fast you run, you'll never catch them. you're never going to please the Danish People's Party in questions of immigration or in questions of refugee policy. So that's why it's certainly wrong on a strategic/instrumental level. But again, it's also wrong on this, if you like, democratic theory level, for two reasons. One is that very often what ends up happening because of these essentially opportunistic concessions to populists is that an entire political spectrum shifts, in this case, to the right, without anybody having ever authorized this in a comprehensive manner. And so all of a sudden, people in, let's say, Denmark or the Netherlands wake up and they realize we've come a long way since we had much more liberal ideas about immigration or, for that matter, refugee policies. And they realize once it's happened, it cannot be easily reversed. So that's one reason. The other reason, though, is that this whole talk of, oh, they know people's real sorrows and concerns, it's not always wrong, it's not always a lie. But very often, this kind of talk implicitly relies on a deep misunderstanding of how democratic representation really works. Democratic representation is not about the mechanical reproduction of always already existing interests or even identities, as if you simply had to transmit these objectively existing things into the political system. No, how citizens perceive their interests, their identities, is of course fundamentally shaped by what they're being offered, by politicians, but also the media, civil society, friends, family, neighbors, what have you. And above all, it's a dynamic process. So I'm flagging this because, of course, it's been a very strong trend in Europe, again, especially among left-wing parties, to basically say, not quite in these words, but in effect, you know, so many years of successes for populists have taught us that, you know, workers hate foreigners. That's just how it is now. You know, we somehow have to adapt to that and change our rhetoric, change our policies in response. But these are not objective givens somehow. It's just as much as a story like this, I think, has to be emphasized about what happened in this country. Many of you probably had similar experiences that on November 9th last year, plenty of Europeans woke up and said, catastrophe. But also, on one level, they experienced perhaps a tiny bit of Schadenfreude. Because they said, look, deep down we always knew it's a country of at least 63 million racists. And now they've really demonstrated to us empirically that we are superior and this is a country full of racists. Now obviously, there are plenty of racists in this country. But as not a few observers pointed out pretty quickly in November last year, it can't be the entire explanation if plenty of people voted for Obama twice and then for Trump. Sure, Trump on one level managed to make a lot of citizens see themselves as de facto part of something like a white identity movement. I think that's very hard to deny. But that is not an objective given now. These self-perceptions can change again. Okay, end of campaign speech. Back to the purely objective social scientific part of the talk. So I've now told you all the things one shouldn't do. What should one do? Two thoughts. One for politicians and one for citizens. I think it's very important that one searches out engagement, or if you like, even confrontation with populists, while always remembering that talking with populists is not the same as talking like populists. Many professional politicians assume that in order to enter a debate, one has to make at least some concessions on the premises of populist actors. One has to sort of share at least some of the ways in which they describe particular political, economic, cultural, etc. challenges. And that is simply not true. At the same time, I think one has to face up to the fact that in a democracy, there's a wide spectrum of positions one can hold on particular policy challenges, including on immigration, for instance, and refugee policies. Personally, I wouldn't like it, but if somebody has very strict or conservative views, it would be difficult for me to simply say, oh, this is obviously undemocratic and could never be discussed in a democracy. So as banal as it perhaps might sound to some of you, the best hope, the best bet remains that other politicians will search out the debate and then hope or trust in the force of the better argument. So far, perhaps so banal. But here's the important addition to this claim. If and when a populist in a debate reveals himself or herself specifically as a populist, then it's extremely important that the other politicians immediately draw a red line. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If a populist politician says, for instance, that Angela Merkel has a secret plan to replace the German folk with Syrians, it's very important. This is a real-world example. This man is leading a party in the Bundestag now, as many of you probably know. If something like this happens, it's very important for the other politicians immediately to say, look, we've now left the territory of quote-unquote normal democratic debate. And something else is going on. Now, to be sure, the populist will not recoil and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was propounding a conspiracy theory, I won't do it again. No, that's not going to happen. But the hope, and maybe it's a pious hope of a democratic theorist, is that plenty of people in the audience, if you like, are going to perhaps say, all right, I might even agree with these actors on certain policy questions, but actually I don't really want to be in the same boat with people who constantly tell me that our democracy is just a facade, that it's all manipulated behind the scenes, that we already live in a dictatorship, that it's like the last days of East Germany before the fall of the wall, etc., etc. And these are all the kinds of things that populists will say. This, I think, is something difficult. It really takes good judgment. It takes a sense of tone and timing. And this is my little plea for professional politicians, who obviously are very unpopular these days. If somebody can do this well, I think citizens should occasionally reward it and say, yes, not everybody can do this so well. If somebody does it, it's important as an act of defending democracy. All right, what can citizens themselves do? Just one small thought. And it actually is partly derived, again, from a real-world example that I already mentioned. Already in December last year, of course, the whole image of the unstoppable wave didn't quite work out because there was the Austrian presidential election, where the man of the people didn't win. And there are plenty of reasons why he didn't win. I'll mention another one in just a few seconds, if I may. But one thing that stood out was that the winning campaign, a winning campaign for somebody who didn't look like he had much of a chance, as I said earlier, a green old professor with dubious ethnic heritage, basically told those citizens who were willing to get engaged, basically told them, look, you don't have to be on board fully with the Green Party program. All you have to do is agree with us that this kind of populism is really dangerous for our democracy. And what we want you to do is go out there and talk to people who you don't usually talk to. Go to parts of Vienna or go to parts of rural Austria where you don't normally go and try to engage other citizens. And by the way, don't tell them after 5 minutes that they're fascist and racist and so on and so forth, because then the conversation isn't going to go very far. Now, I can't prove this to you empirically. Of course, many social scientists are extremely skeptical of this claim. They say, oh, it's a naive hope that if you meet somebody who has different views or is, you might have prejudices about, you just have to meet them, talk, and wow, everything is peace and harmony forever after. Still, there are good reasons to believe that this might make a difference. And it might specifically make a difference because it empirically, concretely, on the ground, if you like, pierces this populist image of a fully homogeneous people. It actually concretely calls it into question in a way that other strategies might not. All right. I can see from your faces that this wasn't quite the uplifting message that perhaps some of you had hoped for. Allow me, though, by way of consolation, to say a few words about the initial claim I made that these sort of macro narratives about waves or post-populist moments are basically misleading and wrong. Why is the image of the inevitable wave wrong? And this is the positive part, so this is now the uplifting part, okay? Why is that image wrong? Well, with all due respect, Nigel Farage didn't bring Brexit about all by himself. He essentially needed his very established, conservative, and I use that word consciously, collaborators. He needed his Boris Johnson's a bit eccentric too, but he needed a figure, for instance, like Michael Gove. Remember, the man who went on British television during the Brexit campaign and said, this country is tired of experts, as a response to the fact that, of course, all experts were saying, don't leave the EU, bad idea economically, politically, and so on and so forth. And that partly wasn't a trivial statement, because after all, Michael Gove has always been seen as a kind of intellectual in the Tory party. It wasn't just anybody who told the country that expertise is overrated. It took an expert to tell the people that expertise is overrated. In this country, at the risk of saying the obvious, Donald Trump didn't become president as the candidate of a third new grassroots protest movement of the angry white working class. No, he was the candidate of a very established party, and he also needed people, heavyweights if you like, who explicitly vouched for him. The Newt Gingriches, the Rudy Giulianis, the Chris Christies of the Republicans. And here also, if you permit one last footnote, it's perhaps interesting to think about the fact that it was Gingrich who went on CNN during the Republican convention, said the usual thing about crime is going through the roof. When he was then confronted by the journalist with the claim that actually the FBI statistics were showing the opposite, he responded by saying, you may believe in what theorists say. I mean, for many of us it was news that the FBI is full of theorists and philosophers and so on, but never mind. You believe in what theorists say, I believe in what people feel. And again, I think it's not trivial that whatever else you think about him, I think it has to be conceded that in the context of the American conservative movement, this is an intellectual. This is somebody who writes books, history books, who does futurological studies. Again, it took a certain kind of person to tell the people that expertise is not what it's cracked up to be. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Long story short, I think that in essence, no, at least right-wing populist has gained power in Western Europe or North America without the collaboration of established conservative elites. Where these conservative elites have largely withheld their support, as was, for instance, the case in Austria in 2016, right-wing populists did not succeed. So that was the uplifting part. What about the other part? What about the supposedly post-populist moment when we can all kind of relax a little bit and fold up our tray tables, lean back, etc.? What's wrong with that image? Well, if you find anything plausible in what I've been trying to tell you this evening, then there is a distinction between, on the one hand, this basic anti-pluralism of populists, this basic claim to a moral monopoly of representation, and on the other hand, specific policy content, which is not in and of itself populist, but which of course can sometimes have what you might call an elective affinity with this core populist claim. A right-wing populist, of course, has to give some content. They have to say why immigration has to be lowered, because there are these people who don't fit here, who don't belong. So they're not unconnected, but they're also not the same. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we can have outcomes, such as, for instance, in the Netherlands, where our official populist candidate, Geert Wilders, indeed doesn't do as well as was feared. But at the same time, we can have a supposedly mainstream, responsible, even liberal, in the European sense, Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who, as you may remember, during the election campaign was putting ads in all Dutch newspapers which said, behave normally or leave the country. This is after, during the 1980s, the slogan of the same liberal party was, be yourself. So they've come a long way. I hope you can see what I'm trying to get at. Yes, populism didn't triumph, but populist policy content of sorts did make a significant advance. So my last plea this evening, and perhaps there have been too many pleas already, is to get away from this overly simplistic attitude, where now with every election in Europe, or for that matter around the globe, all we ever ask is, oh, is populism up or is populism down? No, it's a complex, multi-dimensional phenomenon, and very often it's not simply a matter of win or lose. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you for an outstanding lecture. We have time for a discussion, questions, in about 20 minutes. So we have people with microphones on each side. I would ask you to actually wave to them, and they will bring the microphone to you. I would ask that you be brief in your questions so that that you have time to answer in those 20 minutes.
Okay.
Could you just say also your name when you ask a question?
We'll start here and then.
Hi, my name is Ann Pitcher, and I'm in Afro-American and African Studies and Political Science here. You stated a number of suggestions that politicians should follow in order to confront populists, but with regard to citizens, you basically said that we should just talk to them. And I don't find that very satisfactory. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on concrete ways to engage with people who disagree with us, or concrete ways to organize to challenge the populist message.
I concede the point that it was very brief, not very concrete, and above all, of course, not very original, because I was just simply paraphrasing, as some of you will have no doubt recognized, the very last word of the 44th president of this country, who in his very final speech said, get off the internet arguing with strangers, go out in the streets, actually talk to people in bars, restaurants, whatever it might be. Just a variation on that idea. Now, concretely, in those engagements, I would stick to the point that I was trying to make with regard to politicians, where basically on substantive policy issues, you present the best argument you have. When somebody reveals themselves as this kind of exclusionary populist I'm talking about, then a different register of argument is needed. Now, of course, that sounds very neat and nice in the abstract. In practice, of course, it's a gray area. Of course, even Trump, when pushed on certain points, would say, look, it's not true that I hate all Mexicans or I'm inciting hatred against a particular minority. I love tacos and so on. It's only the rapists and the drug dealers and so on. But again, of course, everybody knows what is being suggested. But that doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. I think you can basically try to make exactly this kind of point plausible to somebody, and then just hope that occasionally, at least, that kind of argument gets across. But again, I think it's the right mixture between drawing the red line at the right moment, and in other moments, basically saying, look, we have to argue over these specific policies. Above all, though, and forgive me for, in a sense, saying the obvious, above all, try to let go of these assumptions about who other people are and where they're coming from. I don't want to use the word deplorable, but of course that's what I'm essentially alluding to. You cannot have these kinds of generalizations. You can attack somebody who says it explicitly. You can attack the candidate, the party, or let's say the civil society organizations who are spouting that kind of stuff. But to simply say, because you are supporting person X, I know exactly what you're all about, I think is a kind of presumption that is not a good thing to have in a democracy. And one wouldn't like it if the other side did it in return, and it basically becomes a sort of conversation stopper. Having said that, you can see it's piling the subtleties on top of further subtleties. Of course, there is a legitimate question in terms of saying, but look, I understand that not everybody who votes for candidate X necessarily is on board with the program. But isn't there a threshold that after candidate X has said Y, there simply is no longer a way to be on board with that person without, on one level at least, condoning that message. So I think that is the last thought I'll offer. That, I think, again, complicates the picture massively. And I think there is, of course, by now a banal thing to say, that forever and ever one will have to go back to Republicans and say that, look, there was a moment when the fact that you didn't speak up committed you. Even if you were just silent or you talked about something else, there is simply no way of escaping that commitment if one then goes forward. And I know I haven't really answered your questions, but I hope we're all confused at a higher level in some way.
There's another.
Hi, I'm Jake, and I had a question. You kind of singled out the populists on the right, but aren't the populists on the left just as dangerous, I would argue? And also, they kind of just seem to there seem to be a lot of overlap between your definition of populism and both parties in our country, at least. I don't know, anything to add to that?
No, it's an important question, because I realize I could have given the impression that this is purely a right-wing phenomenon, and it's not. Sometimes people say, especially in Europe, no, by definition there can't be left-wing populism because the left is always good, populism is always bad, so can't possibly go together. And that's not true. You can have the same anti-pluralist claiming of a moral monopoly of representing the people on the left. It will just be a different kind of content, obviously. And probably will not surprise you that, in a sense, the prime examples of that left-wing stance in our era are figures like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela. That's the kind of situation, or that's the kind of country that could have been added to the ones I mentioned sort of during the middle of the talk. So nothing, in a sense, prevents that position from being possible. Having said that, at least in my view, it clearly is not the case, whatever else one thinks about these characters, that there's any kind of symmetry between, let's say, Trump and Bernie Sanders. One doesn't have to like Bernie Sanders' program, but to say that they're in the same category, if one accepts my understanding of populism, is, I think, just plain wrong. And in that sense, I hope we can, in a sense, hold on to the insight by Hannah Arendt that the essence of political judgment is the capacity to draw distinctions, and always mixing up all these different actors really prevents us sometimes significantly from comprehending our political reality.
Hi, I'm Anne. How does the Catalonia vote from Sunday fit into this scheme? How does the Catalonia vote fit into this?
I was hoping nobody was going to ask that. I'll give you a very unsatisfactory answer. I am a theorist, okay? So I give you a grid, which, if you find anything worthwhile in it, hopefully helps us to decide to judge certain actors this way or that way. From the little I know about some of the actors in the independence movement, they sound pretty populist in my sense to me. That's not a judgment of the cause, whether it's just or unjust, it's just basically a judgment of their kind of rhetoric. And if there's anything to that thought, then of course it's maybe not so surprising that yes, they've consciously engaged in a certain kind of culture war, yes, they've been quite willing to escalate, even though of course I think at this point the overwhelming part of the blame rests with Rajoy rather than that movement. So that's where I would go if I knew anything about it.
Is it? After him, yeah. After him.
Hi, Professor Miller. First of all, thanks for the very thought-provoking lecture. I understand that you gave two solutions, one for the politicians and one for the people. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little more on the potential role institutions can play. Like, do you believe if there is any chance we can build or reform our institutions, our electoral rules or the judiciary branches to the extent that we can counter populism, or do you think whether no matter how we reform our institutions, like populists can find a way to destroy all of that? Yeah, thanks.
I have 3 hours to answer this, right? So look, as I was trying to hint at various points in the talk, populists will always engage in some form of culture war, which means that in countries where some kind of level of cultural confrontation is already present, they might have an easier time. And they will certainly then sort of fan the flames inside people more and so on. The mistake, I think, that is sometimes made is that people sort of take these culture wars for granted, or they treat them as if they were natural. And of course, in many cases, they're far from being natural or given or anything of that sort. I mean, yes, if you read David Brooks, you think this is, red and blue, this is just the way it is. It's given. And nobody asks how it might relate to institutions and to, just to roil off the obvious examples, gerrymandering, or in a sense, the loss of a certain type of media pluralism, the increasing fragmentation of public spheres. In other words, rather than what people very often do today, or which has become a sort of default option for many theorists and political commentators after Brexit and Trump, which is to basically blame the people themselves, okay? They don't understand globalization, they're all racist, these sorts of arguments. Rather than doing that, I think it's much more important, as you are in a sense suggesting, to look at the institutions which in some contexts are clearly exacerbating problems like a sense that we are completely divided and can't really talk to each other. Now what this means in practice would take a long time to kind of detail. There are a couple of obvious things like non-partisan, commissions to draw electoral districts, this sort of stuff. Also a very difficult question of how to regain a certain level of media pluralism in contexts where it has been lost. I mean, this isn't quite your question, but if I may, I'll slip in one thought that perhaps is of interest in this context. When you think about some of the regimes I described, it of course matters that they all say, we're Democrats. So they don't officially leave democracy behind. They don't say, oh, we discovered that technocracy is better, or some other new kind of form of governance. They all will insist that they are still proper democracies. And some of them are spending a lot of efforts and also a lot of money to basically have outside observers recognize that status. Now, one would have thought that in a situation like this, there's an obvious strategy for oppositional forces, civil disobedience, right? Where you can basically say, look, we're appealing to principles which the regime itself shares and is on record as sharing. And as I'm sure you know, there's some social scientists who've gone very far in saying that, we have robust evidence that if you can continuously mobilize something like 3.5% of your population against the regime will have lost. And 3.5% is not a big number. So one would have thought, look, this is obviously the answer. And remember the 90s, even Milosevic fell, just a bunch of young people who were smart and, strategic, and they knew how to do this. And we don't see these things anymore. So why? So one possible explanation, and I cannot sort of prove it to you here, but maybe it's worth thinking about, is that, of course, an absolutely crucial ingredient of civil disobedience was always publicity. Other people had to hear about the injustice, other people had to hear about the regime not living up to these standards, and so on. And of course, that's the one thing we cannot take for granted anymore. We all love a famous Danish fairy tale. All it takes is for one child to say that the emperor has no clothes, and everybody, finally is willing to admit it. But of course, the fairy tale presumes that everybody can hear the child. And we increasingly live in a world where, the child might be off in a totally separate media sphere, and the majority of the population never hears about, the emperor's sartorial choices according to somebody who is willing to speak the truth. Again, this is a hypothesis. I cannot prove this to you, but I think it's an interesting question to ask. Why in these regimes which on paper, given what we know from 20th century history, would seem to be relatively vulnerable to these sorts of strategies, why we don't see more of that strategy being applied successfully.
I'm going to take a couple of questions in a row just to make sure that you have time to conclude. We have a student here.
Yes. Go ahead.
Should I?
If you can be brief, we're going to take 3, Kathleen, with a question, and then you can hold it on your question.
Hi there. My name is Anil. In political science at UFM. So I was actually wondering, you suggested advice for the politicians, the citizens. What about the media? Where do they fit in, and traditional as opposed to social media? So.
Another easy question?
Yeah.
Can I? Yeah, okay. Thank you for your speech. I was
basically applying pretty much what you said to Italian context, which is where I come from. But the open clientelism, I don't think we got that far. I realized while you were talking that I kind of like changed my self-perception during this year where the five-star party was kind of in charge. Because I start questioning myself and saying, are you questioning the establishment or not, or you're just taking for granted the status quo because you're like an average, legal educated person. So I was wondering whether in your research you encountered this change in self-perception of the people, of the non-real people, which can become, you know, in the long run, somehow favorable to the populism project. Thank you.
Is there
Another one?
briefly, and then Kathleen, and then
Hi, I'm Kevin Weimer. When you were talking about the kind of shift of language, I guess, to, or more so like policy, as you gave example in the Netherlands, how do you think you could what do you think is a good way to counteract that shift in language on the left and the right, as can be kind of seen today with a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of both sides in general? So what kind of way can you counteract that language shift? What are some ways?
Okay. Well, we are asking you to keep a lot of questions in your head. My last question is really about this kind of tension in your talk and in your book between the ways in which populism creates a danger for democracy, and yet you seem to be suggesting with this kind of more hopeful vision that we break down our own prejudices and go out and use democratic discourse to engage opponents or people who are mobilized around things that we disagree with. But what I'm finding so difficult at the present moment in the States, and that is, I think, different than, for example, some of the European examples, there's really very little embrace of democracy coming from our government. So what I find kind of scary and unusual is that actually democracy is not something that our current government and the people surrounding the president actually seem to embrace. So I'm looking for, I'm seeing this dearth of that rhetoric that we are familiar with that actually is part of your schema. So it makes, there's such an assault on democratic rights that it seems to me that there's a different kind of dismantling of democracy that's taking place, but it's also possible to discuss over dinner.
Thank you for offering me that cop-out. So, traditional media. Just very briefly, this is obviously a very complex thing. None of us, I think, has really the answers at this point. One thing I would stress, we are in a university after all, is that a lot of us have to do a much better job in teaching, in the widest sense, cultural and maybe more specifically visual literacy to better decode some of the phenomena we're seeing. And in particular, I think we have to take on board the lesson that these actors have become much more subtle, much more sophisticated. You know, we as Democrats, I guess, you know, we always reserve that wonderful word learning process for ourselves. So democracies always screw up, we make mistakes all the time, but we are the learning system, and we can admit mistakes and correct them. Authoritarians are all stupid, they're all going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991 and so on. This, I think, has been exposed as a profound illusion. So I think one has to become much better, and that in particular might then apply to journalists, who obviously today are often lacking resources. This is why, I mean, it's a much longer story, but just to gesture at it, this is why, you know, Steve Bannon can succeed with a book like Clinton Cash, because all of a sudden people say, oh, it's actually pretty good research in parts, and we don't have the resources to kind of do all this work ourselves, so let's pick up some of these stories. I mean, these are structural reasons for why things are in that sense going wrong. But I fear none of us at this point has found a comprehensive answer, and more particularly, and perhaps less obviously, none of us has found an answer to the specific populist technique to use something like Twitter to strengthen the illusion of a direct connection with the people. That's not totally new. I mean, in the old days, you may have gone to a party meeting, and here on the stage was the one authentic representative of the people, according to you, but it was an extraordinary experience. It maybe lasted 4 or 5 hours. Now it's 24/7. You wake up in the middle of the night, you look at the president's tweets, you say, oh, just what I was thinking. Probably more the other way around, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I simply cannot see at this point how that sort of space could be opened up for any kind of pluralism. I mean, people are trying, you probably know some of the recent work of Cass Sunstein, who says, look, we have to basically have a button on the internet that says, if you click this, you're going to get an opposing view. But it's fine. But it doesn't seem like this is, the answer yet. What does one do when sorry, about people's self-perceptions? Let me just underline one thing, because again, I may have given the impression tonight that, basically these populists come out of nowhere, and then, they take countries in an authoritarian direction, and, nobody on the outside can possibly understand why this exactly happened. We haven't talked about causes much this evening, but clearly it would be a mistake to, for instance, suggest that, let's say, Venezuela was this perfectly egalitarian, open country, and then crazy Chavez comes along and screws it all up. Or Turkey was this wonderfully pluralist society and government, and then crazy Erdogan comes along and screws it all up. No, I, in a sense, was giving you a grid, or put differently, a snapshot. But of course, these are dynamic processes, and we shouldn't make the mistake that, for instance, was sometimes, I think, committed in studies of fascism, which is not to say fascism and populism are the same thing. I'm just illustrating the point that people had this very static image, and they didn't realize that these are dynamic processes where the responses of the other actors matter, of course, where we can see certain processes of radicalization. So that's always important to bear in mind. Also, then, not to have these sort of quick moral judgments of simply saying, oh, they're basically just all authoritarians. Many phenomena in our day are very much borderline. So when Grillo says, I want 100% in parliament because we deserve 100%, I think he's a populist. There's no way that he recognizes the legitimacy of any of the other actors. When he criticizes La Casta and the existing Italian system, does he have a point in many regards? Of course. So then the question is more, can people somehow provide incentives for some of these actors to stick with some of their content, but stop the anti-pluralism? In theory, that's possible. In theory, you might say, look, we don't condemn you, we don't all call you all deplorables, but we're only going to truly, let's say, work with you if you stop a certain kind of rhetoric. Now, problem is that in practice, I cannot suggest to you a single example of where this has actually happened. Very recently, because we're just in front of those elections, very recently the Austrian Social Democrats kind of tried this. They said, we're going to work out a catalog of criteria that, we're going to have a coalition with any party that meets those criteria. And I think in the abstract, that was not a bad idea. But it didn't work out. By now, they've basically said they're willing to work with the Freedom Party no matter what. So it's a nice idea in theory, but I think it's not the wrong idea. Problem is simply that at least I cannot cite any examples of where these kinds of incentives have worked. And on one level, it's sort of obvious why they might not, because sure, Marine Le Pen is not going to wake up all of a sudden and say, you know what, guys, I didn't mean it. It's not true that all the other people are corrupt and don't work for, ordinary citizens and so on. We just have these policies, they have those policies, let's have an open competition. Of course she's not going to say that. But I think whatever maybe sometimes can be done to sort of move these actors in that direction maybe should be done. So I'm not sure I entirely share the diagnosis that you're putting forward, which is not to say, oh, there's no problem, or it's much more harmless than we thought. I think, especially this past summer, I think people way too quickly concluded that, as one of my colleagues put it recently, yes, he's malevolent, but he's also incompetent, and the incompetence is going to save us. Therefore, don't worry too much. I think this can be a highly naive view in certain regards. At the same time, I don't see this sort of comprehensive disavowal of democracy or even a comprehensive disavowal of rights. I think there's a tendency, certainly, to ignore or write roughshod over constitutional conventions, tacit norms, all these nice old ideas about bipartisanship and so on, very clearly, but that's not entirely new. The Republican Party has been doing this for a long time by now. And there's a tendency to sort of push as far as possible against certain institutions, but not really do the kind of thing that, let's say, an Orban or a Kaczynski would really then try, even if they might not succeed. I mean, the kind of then completely brutal destruction of existing institutions like a constitutional court. Which again is not to say that all is well and the institutions will, you know, keep everything in check and so on. I don't believe that. But I also think that we have to kind of be as precise as possible about the specific dynamics that are going on. And I don't see this comprehensive disavowal, nor do I see a comprehensive attempt to destroy some of the existing institutions. But a lot of the rhetoric that I'm sure you saw, that I was kind of flagging as indicators, is certainly there in pronouncements, or of course in this particular case more likely in tweets. So, you know, when somebody says about protests, they're all paid up activists, that's a kind of red flag for what's wrong. Of course, as a government, you say, we're right, the protesters are wrong. It's another thing to say, it's a conspiracy. So, again, I failed to give you the uplifting message at the very end. All I can once more say is it's more complicated, like all professors always say at the end, but I hope it was nevertheless useful in certain regards. And thank you again for your attention.